talks about a worldwide flood, of a worldwide flood, of a worldwide flood. If there really was a worldwide flood, what would the evidence be?
Welcome to Creation Foundation, where we discuss things from a biblical point of view. I'm Dick Temple.
I'm Mark Finkbeiner.
And I'm Greg Morgan.
You know, it's been a little while since the Ken Ham-Bill Nye debate, but there's quite a few things we can learn from that. And there's some things that really stand out to me. For one thing, the debate topic. Is creation a viable model of origins in today's modern scientific era? Ken Ham made a statement about 3 times that, if people understood it, would have won the debate technically, hands down. He said, "You can't do observational science without borrowing your logic from the creationists." Now that's one that seems to be hard to grasp, but I'm going to try to explain it so you understand it, because to do observational science you have to use creationist logic. And since you can't do real science using the logic used to support evolution, and creation is the only alternative, creation is the only viable model of origins in today's modern scientific era. So, what is creationist logic versus evolutionist logic? Well, creationist logic starts with the belief in the natural laws that God put into place to run the universe. Great scientists like Newton and Pasteur succeeded because they were looking for the laws that God had created. Only the Creator can break natural laws, and this is called a miracle. A miracle with a miracle worker, which is the one who established those laws. Now, evolutionism is based on breaking of natural laws by random chance. The breaking of a natural law at random is called a singularity. You know, we'd call it a miracle except for one thing. There's no singularity worker. Fred Hoyle named the Big Bang, and he called it a singularity. He said it is a singularity transcending all natural law. The Bible says the universe was created in the beginning and creation was completed in 6 days. So what does that mean? You know, what would we see? What does it predict that we would find if we looked around us in the world? Well, that predicts that we can discover the first law of thermodynamics. Matter and energy are interchangeable and are neither created nor destroyed. There is no new source of matter and energy. It's all there. Now, the Bible also says that the universe is wearing out. Now, creationists usually point to the curse, when God cursed the universe as a result of man's sin. Well, it's a little nebulous there, but in Hebrews 1, verses 10 to 12, it's pretty specific. The universe is wearing out. Now, what does this predict? What would we find if this biblical statement were true? Well, it would be the second law of thermodynamics, which does say the universe is wearing out. It states, in every reaction involving matter and energy, there is a net loss of usable energy in the form of unusable heat energy. This is called entropy, the unusable heat energy. And Isaac Asimov added a corollary to this. He said everything goes from organized to random. Well, this is also observed in nature. Now, one theory of evolution is that all the matter in the universe was gathered together in one spot. You know, in one science textbook it says a spot no bigger than a period on this page. Now, that's a pretty heavy dot, you know. And then it exploded, producing everything. Well, this breaks the second law of thermodynamics. You know, if matter and energy were the uncaused cause, in other words, matter and energy had existed from infinity, there would be nothing left but low-grade heat energy. The entropy, unusable energy, would be all that was left in the universe. So to get that sort of an idea, we have to break the second law of thermodynamics. Well, certain scientists recognized that was a problem, so Alan Guth came up with another theory. He said that nothing exploded and produced everything. The problem with that one is, maybe if you had enough faith you could believe it, but this breaks the first law of thermodynamics. To believe in evolution, you must believe in singularities, but no singularity worker. The Bible tells us that all life types were created in the beginning, and that new life only comes from life of the same kind. This predicts the law of biogenesis. I believe the law of biogenesis. Farmers, ranchers, and veterinarians make their living using this law. Evolution requires this law to be invalid because of the multiple singularities required for evolution to occur. The Bible says God caused a global flood which was survived by 8 people and all kinds of animal life. Now this was a miracle, complete with a miracle worker. Now if this was true, what would we find on this earth? Well, one thing it predicts is the conditions necessary to form fossils all over the earth. There have been millions of buffalo died on the Great Plains, but to find buffalo fossils is very rare. But the conditions necessary for a fossil to form is the individual plant or animal must be buried very quickly while it's still in its living shape, and then it must either leave an imprint in sediment that turns into rock, or it must be in a moist environment such as volcanic ash which got wet, or sediment that later turns into rock but has the minerals in it that replace the substance of the animal bones as the animal decomposes. So the global flood produced this all over the earth. Now this also predicts that fossils of sea life should be found on the tops of high mountains, the Rocky Mountains, the Andes Mountains, the Himalayan Mountains, Mount Everest. Guess what? That's exactly what we do find. This predicts that the majority of the earth should be covered with sedimentary rock. And that's what we find. Now it's kind of humorous to me to listen to evolutionists explaining all about the local fossil producing floods when you look around and the evidence is all there for a global flood. Some of these rock layers go for thousands of miles. Creationist logic says that the Creator has a purpose for everything. Evolutionist logic says that there is no purpose for anything. Everything exists by blind chance. The creationist logic is that we can rely on natural laws to work consistently. Therefore, we can expect the same results from observational science and technology tomorrow as we got today. Evolutionist logic requires that natural laws are broken randomly, and when an experiment is repeated, the results may be different at random. Supposing I drop a ball, or hold a ball up and let it go, which way is it going to go? If the law of gravity is in effect, it goes down. But suppose we use evolutionist logic and we drop it. What are we going to see? What can we predict with evolutionist logic? To do observational science, the evolutionist must borrow his logic from the creationist, or make a special pleading that the natural laws were only broken once upon a time, long, long ago, far, far away. To quote Richard Dawkins in context, but that was a long time ago. You wouldn't expect to see that today. The creationist worldview requires an uncaused cause known as the Creator. It is consistent at every point with what we can observe. Natural laws are consistent. The evolutionist worldview requires an uncaused cause, either matter or nothing exploded to produce everything. Natural law must be broken at every point of change from the beginning till now for evolution to have occurred. This is not consistent with what we see in the real world. You see, natural law must be broken multiple times at all points of evolution. Cosmic evolution, the Big Bang, the origin of time, space, and matter. We have to break natural law. The laws of thermodynamics, chemical evolution, The origin of the higher elements from hydrogen. We have to break the laws of chemistry. Stellar and planetary evolution. The origin of stars, planets from dust clouds. We have to break the laws of physics. Organic evolution. The origin of life. We have to break multiple known laws of science for life to come from no life. And macroevolution, one life form changing into another life form, we have to break the laws of biology. Kind of to sum this up, C.S. Lewis said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator. In most modern scientists, this belief has died. It will be interesting to see how long their confidence in uniformity survives it. Two significant developments have already appeared: the hypothesis of a lawless subnature and the surrender of the claim that science is true. We may be living nearer than we suppose to the end of the scientific age. C.S. Lewis had a very scientific mind, a very incisive mind. You know, he wrote that in 1947. You know? So if a evolutionist is going to do observational science, he has to use the laws or the logic of the creationist, because the logic of evolutionism does not work. So Mark, what do you have to say about what you saw in the debate?
One of the things that really perked me up is when Bill Nye was talking about the Missoula flood. Now, that's something that I pretty much specialize in the science that I do, is the Missoula flood, because I have a field trip business, Science Adventure Tours, and I take lots of people out in the Pacific Northwest to observe the geological evidence of the Missoula flood. And so when Bill Nye when he brought this up, my ears, of course, they perked up. And here's what he said about the Missoula flood.
Now, as you may know, I was graduated from engineering school, and I got a job at Boeing. I worked on 747s. Okay, everybody relax. I was very well supervised. Everything's fine. There's a tube in the 747 I kind of think of as my tube. But that aside, I traveled the highways of Washington State quite a bit. I was a young guy. I had a motorcycle. I used to go mountain climbing in Washington State, Oregon. And you can drive along and find these enormous boulders on top of the ground. Enormous rocks, huge, sitting on top of the ground. Now, out there in regular academic pursuits, regular geology, people have discovered that there used to be a lake in what is now Montana, which we charmingly refer to as Lake Missoula. It's not there now, but the evidence for it, of course, is, if I may, overwhelming. And so an ice dam would form at Lake Missoula, and once in a while it would break. It would build up and break. And there were multiple floods in my old state of Washington State. And just before we go on, let me just say, go Seahawks. That was very gratifying. Very gratifying for me. Anyway, you drive along the road, and there are these rocks. So if, as is asserted here at this facility, that the heavier rocks would sink to the bottom during a flood event, the big rocks, and especially their shape, instead of aerodynamic, the hydrodynamic, the water-changing shape, as water flows past. You'd expect them to sink to the bottom. But here are these enormous rocks right on the surface, and there's no shortage of them. If you go driving in Washington State or Oregon, they're readily available. So how could those be there if the Earth is just 4,000 years old? How could they be there if this one flood caused that?
Well, I want you to understand, Bill Nye did not do his research on what we creation scientists believe about what happened, the Missoula flood and Noah's flood. First of all, none of us believe that the Earth is 4,000 years old, okay? We believe that it's at least 6,000 years old, and, you know, I'll give you a few years more if you stop crying, okay, than that. But anyway, I was trying to figure out, what's Bill Nye really trying to say here, because none of this made sense. But what I think what he's trying to say is that we believe that Noah's flood, the universal flood, caused these, what he called boulders, to be planted here in the state of Washington? Well, first of all, if you know anything about geology at all, you know that those rocks that he's referring to are not boulders. Okay? A boulder has to be a rock, I believe it has to be about the size of a softball or bigger, and it had to be rolled, so it's kind of got a rounded type edges to it, no sharp edges. Okay? So the rocks he's referring to, first of all, are not boulders. Okay? Second of all, how those rocks got there, we do not believe they got there because of the universal flood. We believe that they got there because of a flood that happened after Noah's flood called the Missoula flood. Now I want you to understand that after the universal flood, Noah's flood, there was still a lot of catastrophism going on. So we had these different ice age floods that occurred after Noah's flood. Okay? One of them being the Missoula flood. And so anyway, how these rocks got here, they got here on icebergs. They were rafted down here on icebergs as a result of Missoula flood. And when the iceberg got hung up on the ground, the berg then would melt and dump its load. And it would leave all these rocks just sitting around, and we call those rocks erratics. Now, he didn't call it that. He kind of talked like he didn't really know what these rocks were. Well, we call them erratics. They floated down on icebergs, got hung up, dumped their load, and some places there was so much dirt in those icebergs that when they melted, they actually left a huge mound of dirt, and we call those berg mounds. And you can see some berg mounds out on Highway 240 as you're going past the Hanford Project here in the state of Washington. They would be on the, I believe it's the right side of the road. Okay? And you'll see these erratics. Now these erratics, what kind of rocks they are? Most of them are granite. Because they came from, Montana, northern Idaho, and they floated down here on icebergs when the Missoula Lake, when it broke. Okay? And so, yeah, you have this lake, we call it an ice age lake, after Noah's flood. The lake started to build up. Eventually the water breached its dam. The water flowed over the ice dam and then flowed down here, and there's huge rocks in some of these icebergs that floated down here. Okay? And so that's the origin of these rocks. So they're not boulders because they had not been rolled. Okay? And also, Bill Nye, he mentioned several Missoula floods, that Missoula Lake had emptied itself many, many times. Well, you have to understand, though, where Bill Nye is coming from here, and this has not been mentioned yet, but Bill Nye is a uniformitarianist. Okay? That's why he brought up all the different things that he brought up, like the bristle cone pine tree and the ice cores and then the many Missoula floods, because he believes in uniformitarianism. Now, the uniformitarianism is a big word, and it simply means that the present is the key to the past. So in other words, you go to the Grand Canyon and you look down that canyon and you see this little tiny river we call the Colorado River. When I went to the Grand Canyon, my goodness, I had to look for that river. It was so small in comparison to the canyon. And here's what a lot of people don't tell you, is that the Grand Canyon is actually about 100 miles wide. We know that now from satellite pictures. Now normally we are told that the Grand Canyon is about 18 miles wide at its widest, okay? Well, that's where you stand in the canyon and you look across, you can see across real well. But the Grand Canyon is actually a canyon within the canyon. So the whole canyon is really 100 miles wide. Now Bill Nye and his friends, their flood model, or their uniformitarian model, they want me and you to believe that little tiny river carved out that huge canyon. Well, that's about like believing that a raindrop carved out the Columbia Gorge. Okay, I don't have that much faith. And so the Colorado River has been carving out the Grand Canyon one sand grain particle at a time over millions and millions of years. That's uniformitarianism. And what the uniformitarianists do not allow for is for catastrophes. And you see, we believe there was Noah's flood, and then that was a world catastrophe, and then after that you had all these other catastrophes that happened after Noah's flood, like the Missoula flood, and then the flood that came from Utah, the Great Salt Lake, I'm trying to remember the name of that one. Lake Bonneville, that's right, the Bonneville flood, and that's what carved out Hell's Canyon. Okay, so anyway, that's all I'm going to say for right now, and I'm going to turn it over to Dick.
Well, I'll just pass it on to Greg. I think you have some comments on the debate.
Okay, very briefly, Mark just mentioned that Bill Nye brought up the matter of ice cores. Ice cores are where they have taken large drills and they drill them down and they into the ice and they pull it up and it's full of ice. They then lay that on its side and they count the rings or layers on that ice core. Now, the uniformitarians would have us believe that there are so many layers in there that it cannot possibly have developed since the global flood. Well, apparently Bill Nye has not paid much attention to two things. One is something called Glacier Girl. Glacier Girl was a P-38 aircraft which was forced to make an emergency landing in Greenland during World War II. The crew, fortunately, were able to walk out of there and did make it back safely. That's fortunate because they lived. It's also fortunate because they were able to say where they had landed it. And many years later, people went in trying to find it because P-38s are rare, and they expected to find this under maybe a foot of snow. Well, they did locate it. In 1992, they dug it out of the ice. It was 260 feet deep in the ice. Here's the airplane. 260 feet of ice have developed over that in between 1942 and 1992. They dug it out, restored it, and they've been flying it to a lot of air shows. When they dug down, they found hundreds, by some accounts thousands, of layers of ice in that 260 feet. So much for Bill Nye's claim that these things develop one layer per year. 50 years and it's thousands of layers. It's also 50 years and 260 feet. Well, if we project back into the past and say that that's the rate of accumulation of ice and snow in Greenland, how many feet of ice and snow are there? Well, it's about 3 kilometers deep, about 10,000 feet. At 5 feet per year, that's only a few thousand years to develop that much. So they're ignoring two things there. They're ignoring the number of layers, which we actually know can accumulate in that length of time, and they're ignoring the rate at which it accumulates. They often claim that that amount of ice took millions of years to develop. But a historical science, we compare it with observational science, observation says 5 feet per year, and therefore it's only about 2,000 years of accumulation, assuming a constant accumulation rate. I don't want to make the same error that's often made. I don't know how rapidly it accumulated over that period of time, nor does anyone else. But it's more consistent with the 5 feet than it is with anything else. The other thing that Bill Nye kind of ignored, he said he went to a university in the northwestern U.S. and did a lot of mountain climbing around here. Well, he should have seen that as he watches for avalanches, he should have known, the people who are careful about avalanches know, if you get a layer of snow that falls, another layer of snow that falls on top of it, this layer can slide on top of that one because there's a nice bonding layer between them. each snowfall during the winter produces another layer. And they also find that as it compacts down, the nightly temperature changes can put more layers into that. So in one winter, you might have 90 or 100 layers. When that compresses down into a glacier, you should expect to see hundreds of layers per year, not the one per year that Bill Nye talked about. When you take these facts into account, the ice core layers tell us Greenland and Antarctica have not been around for very long. At least the ice on them has not been around for very long. Very much contrary to what Bill Nye was trying to claim. Dick?
Another interesting fact about this is Greenland used to be green. You know, when the Vikings came to Greenland, this was in the last 2,000 years, they settled and farmed Greenland because, actually it was a little more than 2,000 years, because the water in the oceans was still fairly warm from the global flood. Therefore, we had a Mediterranean climate effect on the continent of Greenland. And we have maps that were drawn by these Vikings that are very accurate for the entire surface of Greenland. So that the glacier on Greenland is a more recent event after the cooling of the oceans, which occurred after, over a long period of time after the global flood.
Now, one of the extraordinary claims associated with Mr. Ham's worldview is that this giant boat, very large wooden ship, went aground safely on a mountain in the Middle East, what we now call the Middle East. And so places like Australia are populated then by animals who somehow managed to get from the Middle East all the way to Australia in the last 4,000 years. Now that to me is an extraordinary claim. We would expect then, somewhere between the Middle East and Australia, we would expect to find evidence of kangaroos. We would expect to find some fossils, some bones. In the last 4,000 years, somebody would have been hopping along there and died along the way, and we'd find them. And furthermore, there's a claim that there was a land bridge that allowed these animals to get from Asia all the way to the continent of Australia, and that land bridge has disappeared.
You see, there's a lot to be explained here simply by the global flood, in the fact with all the volcanoes going off, the water heated all over the earth, created the Mediterranean climate all around the earth, along the coasts, and the water being warm, it put more water vapor up into the air, and it, of course, came down as snow or rain, but on the continents, it was cooler because we still had the volcanic ash up in the atmosphere. The sun wasn't getting down to it as much, so the oceans were much lower at that time because of all the ice accumulation on the continents. This created the land bridge between Siberia and Alaska and the land bridge between Asia and Australia. How'd the kangaroos get to Australia? They hopped. You know, there was the land bridge, but as the air cleared, the sun warmed the continents, then the ice water ran into the oceans cooled, and we get the climate we have today. Another thing that Bill Nye mentioned was the bristlecone pine with those rings. Well, we have the same sort of a deal. We have a summer-winter stress versus no stress causing the rings on the trees. How many stress situations did these trees go through to produce those rings? It's fairly simple if you take and look at it from various points of view. You can see what makes the most sense if you're willing to think. Now, if you'd like more information on creation evolution, we can go to the website, creationfoundations.org, and Mark's done a terrific job of putting this together. Very many links that you can get to other websites. Tremendous amount of information besides just what we come up with these television programs. There's a world of information waiting for you just right there at creationfoundations.org.
If there really was a worldwide flood, what would the evidence be?